Welcome once again to HorrorBabble. Today we have yet another MD Vickers tale for you. This one is called Home Tutor. I hope you enjoy it. Home Tutor by MD Vickers. Michael Cleaves's footfalls reverberated around the confines of the narrow corridor as he slowly traversed it. His hands overlapped one another behind his back, and he was staring intently at the ground, not seeing the floor itself, but a rapid succession of troubled thoughts instead. He was the headmaster. This was his school, and it was literally falling to pieces, above, below, and to all sides of him. Not that it hadn't been a worthy school before, of course. Construction of the buildings had been completed at the beginning of the last century, 1909 to be exact. But that was 100 years ago. Repairs since then had been scant, to say the least. Staffing levels were another problematic burden. A mere 25 existing teachers balanced against nearly 1,100 pupils. Governor meetings had proved predictably futile, promising everything yet delivering nothing. It was a hopeless case, and, to put the proverbial lid on an already depressing situation, his wife had walked out on him for good 2 months ago. Shaking his head slowly, he looked up from the severely abraded floor and concentrated his gaze on a classroom door to his right, beyond which a tremendous furore beckoned. The clamor began to subside several seconds after the opening of the door. His son, Dean, was sat at the front with a book open on his desk. He seemed to have deliberately detached himself from the chaos surrounding him. Damn these kids, inhibiting his talented son's education. He realized that his anger was misdirected, but was unable to prevent it. "Silence!" The entire class of pupils immediately obliged. Chairs creaked as front legs were reinstated on the floor. It was a Russian language lesson, devoid of a teacher. What a refreshing change, thought Cleaves sourly. He closed the door behind him and instructed them to take out their textbooks, while he attained a copy himself and began scribbling exercises down on the antiquated blackboard with a pathetically small stub of white chalk. Upon leaving, some 10 minutes later, he decided that it was time for a chat with Martin Brett regarding an idea he'd had concerning his intelligent son's future. When the alarm sounded, signifying the 15-minute afternoon break, he made his way over to the science blocks. His pace was noticeably quicker on this occasion. This time, he had a purpose, and the more he thought about it, the more brilliant an idea it became. Striding efficiently through the milling exodus of screaming children, he negotiated the double doors of the dilapidated building and subsequently pushed open a door marked simply S5. Martin Brett, primarily a lecturer of electronics, was sat behind his desk, assembling paperwork into a neat pile. He was 44 years old, drastically receding, and supported a prosthetic right leg that he had designed and built himself. His real limb had been deliberately dismembered at the hip to make way for it. He glanced up as Michael Cleaves approached him. Both men had had a few run-ins in the past, mostly over trivial things that they hadn't seen eye to eye on. As far as the present went, they were on speaking terms, yet nourished an underlying mild contempt for each other that couldn't be shaken. Cleaves outlined his idea with enthusiasm and vigor. Brett regarded him impassively as he expounded. The idea was incredible, to say the least. He opened his mouth to begin telling him so, and then immediately closed it again, as the financial aspect was strategically introduced. Martin Brett said nothing for a seemingly long time. Then, "Why don't you just enroll him at another school?" Cleave shook his head dismissively. "I've asked him, but he's a shy boy. Clever, but shy. He'd rather stay here with his friends." The end-of-break alarm suddenly erupted into life. Michael Cleaves rose up from his chair and made for the door. Think it over. Think about the money. You're the finest science teacher I've worked with. I know you can do it. My son needs the best, and I think you can supply it." He wrenched open the door and paused on the threshold. "I'm off to a meeting now. I should be back around 3. Remember what I've said." With that, he left. His exit was accompanied by a resounding slam of the door. Martin Brett leaned back in his chair and began to mull it over. He finally reached a decision in his mind and hoisted himself from the chair. He was supposed to be sitting in on Form 7 for the final period, but there were hardly any students there anyway. Instead, he would nip home and pick up his books on automation, get a bit of initial groundwork done. He grabbed his coat, scooped up his briefcase, and left the room. This time, the door was treated with a little more respect. The journey took approximately 12 minutes. As he turned the corner of his street, he immediately observed Cleaves's car parked outside his house. Perhaps equally as bizarre, he also noted his wife's car in the driveway. She usually didn't finish work till 7. He pulled in front of his next-door neighbor's front wall and behind the head teacher's vehicle. His mind had gone into overdrive. It was definitely Cleaves's car. Identical number plate. No more proof was needed. Emerging apprehensively from behind the wheel of his own car, he started up the drive. The front door was unlocked, as he knew it would have been. Frowning, he stepped inside and stood motionless in the hallway. The sounds coming from upstairs were leaving nothing to the imagination. He was instantly consumed by a total red rage coupled with a stunned disbelief. His hands clenched and unclenched. His lips drew apart to reveal grinding teeth. He couldn't work out who enraged him more, his betraying bitch of a wife, or that egotistical, arrogant bastard, Cleaves. So, he wanted a home tutor for his stupid, scrawny geek of a son, did he? Then he would get one. Oh, yes, indeed. He would most definitely get one. Over the ensuing months, Martin Brett chose not to mention the incident to anyone. Instead, he channeled all his furious aggression into his project. The task was an exceedingly complex one, but he was equal to the challenge. Whenever the thought of the odious Cleaves in bed with his wife entered his mind, he would launch a tremendous series of blows onto a specially selected item of furniture. The furniture in question was a mahogany dining table. The instrument, a weighty 6-foot barbell. One particular night, several weeks previously, a frenzied succession of no less than 30 massive strikes had been achieved. With each hit, an intense vibration had raced up his arm and through his whole body. This had enraged him more, serving to increase the tempo of the blows. He had learned after that, and now affixed a 2-kilogram weight to the end of the bar before each anger bout. His son, Nick, had rigged up a makeshift gymnasium in the garage. He was getting increasingly curious and a little disturbed by his father's borrowing of his equipment. He had never expressed an interest in keeping fit before, and at his age as well. Also, there was the fact that he seemed to be spending a hell of a long time in his study these days. He was obviously building something in there, judging by the deafening noise that frequently emitted from behind the sealed door. In the end, he had reasoned that his dad was an oddball, an eccentric. The best thing was to just leave him be in his own world. At this present moment in time, Brett was leaning back in his swivel chair, pondering over the present situation. He had been working on the robot for a good 5 months now, and calculated that in about another 2, it would be completed. It was coming on well, very well. The night before, he had inadvertently tapped a thin red wire within the spaghetti junction of its cerebral cortex. A powerfully strong arm had promptly administered a crushing headlock on him. Frantically, he had begun pulling wires at random, terrifying thoughts of being destroyed by his own invention filling his brain. After 3 very long seconds, the arm had pivoted upwards, accompanied by a string of unintelligible utterances, from the closed mouth of the automaton. He now had a huge black bruise on the side of his neck, which he had hidden with a sweater of the polo-necked variety. That had been very scary indeed. He would have to ensure that there were no repeat performances in the future. A few more weeks, though, and the metal skull casing would be ready, covering the vulnerable mesh of circuitry. After that, the features would be created, and it would then be finished. Notify Cleves of the fact, and a justifiable revenge commences operation. An upturning of the thin set of lips started to manifest itself on Martin Brett's pallid face. Several seconds later, he was grinning from ear to ear. 6 weeks later, Brett was again sat in his chair, pondering. He was using the chair in his classroom this time, slightly less comfortable. The robot was complete. For nearly 7 months he had sweated and toiled. The mahogany dining table was now severely scarred and ravaged. Inside, he was still a swirling cauldron of emotion, but less so now. Now he could relax slightly, content in the knowledge that vengeance was imminent, possibly this very night. A brief glance down at his watch told him it was a little after 2. What could he do now? The anxious state he was still in was preventing him from doing anything that involved constructive thought of any kind. His mind felt like a dark, impenetrable void. The door suddenly opened. The head of Michael Cleves appeared in the gap. "I'm off to a meeting. Be back around 3. How's the tutor coming along?" Brett decided to respond to the question without looking at his face. "It's ready for you to pick up whenever you want." Cleves seemed not to observe the lack of visual contact. "Good. I'll come round tonight, about 7. The science teacher glanced his way this time, before speaking. "Don't forget the financial amount." The expression on the head teacher's face remained the same, one of arrogant complacency. "You'll get your money, as long as a satisfactory result has been attained. If it's flawed, I won't have it. Can you see where I'm coming from, Mr. Brett?" "The exact location has been pinpointed and documented, Mr. Cleves." The door slammed to in its frame. There had been a total lack of gratitude in the headmaster's harshly spoken words. The fact didn't bother Martin Brett at all. It served to fuel his hatred for the man even more. 6 minutes later, he was still sat tensely in the chair. Every muscle in his body was taut. His right leg was the only calm part of him. He knew exactly where the bastard would be now, in his bed, with his wife. And he thought he didn't know, thought he didn't suspect a dicky bird, presumed he was totally innocent of the whole sordid mess. This was getting unbearable. He stood up and proceeded to pace up and down. To hell with the library and Form 7. It had taken enough out of him trying to cope with his last class. There had been a few sniggers behind barely concealing hands, and he suspected his old-fashioned polo neck was the object of their mirth. He had to admit it had been in his wardrobe for at least 20 years, but nothing else would cover his neck properly. The bruise, while no longer black, was now a hideous orangey-yellow color. His wife had expressed a nagging concern about it, and had almost received a vigorous battering. He had checked himself at the very last second, and told her to just shut it and get out of his face. The settee downstairs had been his sleeping quarters since the day he'd made the loathsome discovery. He suspected his wife suspected he knew something was going on, but doubted she'd told Cleves anything. He didn't in the least care anyway. Another nervous glance at his watch informed him it was now 11 minutes past. He sat back down and removed a large cricket from a jar on his desk. He had confiscated it from Alex Younger a couple of days ago. Younger was a strange lad, with just one eye in the middle of his forehead. His father had apparently served in the Gulf War nearly 20 years ago. The cricket, roughly the size of a mouse, began to squirm sickeningly around in his hand. Without hesitation, he crushed it, baring his teeth as he did so. Black juice spurted through his fingers and splattered the paperwork on his desk. A drop landed on his lips, and he brushed it away with his tongue, vaguely acidic. He dropped the mangled carcass into the waste paper basket, where it landed with a brief rustle. Damn Cleves. Damn him. He normally wouldn't harm so much as a dust mite, and here he was wiping bits of shell and limbs off his hand onto a paper towel. The thought soon lost its power, though. Another 5 or so hours from now, his android would be carrying out the task that he had programmed it to do, to destroy Michael Cleves, and his family along with it. As soon as the bell sounded, indicating home time, Martin Brett was out of the room and opening the door of his car in an instant. Things needed to be organized and rechecked. Time was fleeting. He arrived home at just before 4. Both his wife's car and Cleves's had probably long since departed. His wife was self-employed and obviously exploiting that status to its fullest. His son usually got in around 1:15. He clambered out of the car that he had rolled into the driveway and let himself in. The house was deathly silent. The dropping of his briefcase onto the hall floor made him twitch slightly. Such were his anxiety levels. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the optional chairlift. Sliding the remote control out of his inside jacket pocket, he aimed it at the red square in the center of the study door. He carried the remote with him everywhere, reasoning that it was safer that way. The door slid aside on its tracks, and he entered. A similar procedure was carried out to close it. The robot was sat on a chair, staring blandly at the floor. He inserted the data chip that was needed to kickstart its artificial nerve structure. The circuitry immediately became activated. Its head raised itself and directed a concentrated gaze at him. A voice, exactly like his own, said,
"Hello, I'm your home tutor. How do you do?"
As soon as it had spoken the words, it reached forward and fiercely grabbed the life-sized mannequin that had been standing opposite it. Sheer terror flooded the whole of Martin Brett's body as the robot launched into a frenzied succession of massive blows with its right arm. The first blow effortlessly swiped off the head of the dummy, knocking it several inches into the plaster like a laser bolt. Brett found himself crouching down, shielding his head with his arms as plastic limb missiles came at him, threatening to decapitate. When the entire mannequin had been pulverized, the robot sat back down and automatically deactivated itself. Its creator erected himself from his hunched position. His thudding heart was beginning to slow down now that the terrifying moment had passed. He walked cautiously over, half expecting a limb to initiate another movement. It didn't, simply because he hadn't programmed it to do so. The kickstart chip had to be reinserted before it could carry out a repeat bout of devastating violence. Anything vaguely resembling a human form that was within a vicinity of 6 feet stood no chance. Last night, he had done a complex adjustment which enabled the robot to recognize him and therefore show a little respect by not beating him to a pulp. Grinning eerily, Brett began to unscrew the top of the android's head after pulling down the latex scalp. He was whistling tunefully as he did so. Now that he had given it the final test, it was time to remove the safety barrier, so to speak. By the end of his little alteration session, the restraint mechanism would cease to function, the result of 1 or 2 severed wires. He heard the front door slam half an hour later and presumed it was Nick, home from school. He shouted a greeting that wasn't returned. Shrugging to himself, he continued his snipping with the pliers. The door slammed again minutes later, followed by his wife's high-pitched cry of, "Hiya!" He didn't answer, choosing instead to wipe the palm of his hand over his sweat-soaked brow. An almost furtive glance at his watch told him he had just under 2 hours left. It was 15 minutes to 7 by the time he'd located the last of the minute threads and broke its relay. He placed the pliers on the floor and stood up from his chair. Time to get everything tidy for Cleves's visit. A good start would be to put the data chip somewhere safe till he arrived. He reached behind the robot towards the table and discovered that there was nothing on it. Singing distractedly to himself, he straightened up, and the robot began to jerk. His questing visual search stopped upon reaching his cluttered workbench as the frightening realization dawned. The kickstart chip was still inside the slot at the back of its neck. He had forgotten to withdraw it before commencing the operation. With his heart now thudding quickly and heavily, he started to scrabble with trembling fingers at the back of the robot's head. Panic was welling up inside him and flooding his brain. The head of the android suddenly whipped to the right. Brett fell back, frantically rubbing his jaw, which felt broken. He crawled hurriedly to a position behind the chair that the automaton was still sat on. Standing back up, he could see the chip nestled in the slot. His arm snaked forward in a bid to deftly remove it before all hell broke loose. The robot began to speak inarticulately. Martin Brett's fingers were inside the aperture and encroaching the small box of circuitry contained there. He tugged at it, but it refused to slide out. Almost screaming, he renewed his frantic efforts. The chip had gone in further. He could only get the tips of his fingers around it. Fresh rivulets of perspiration broke out and proceeded to course over his eyebrows and drip. The grunts issuing from the android grew thicker as liquid began to be expelled. Brett started to scream as it rose up from the chair and turned towards him. His remote control. Of course, his remote control in his jacket pocket. He reached inside and pulled out his savior, aiming it directly at the middle of the door. The robot punched him. The tremendous blow smashed into the side of his temple and killed him instantly. Brett struck the wall, rebounded, and fell forwards. His head squelched against the door. His invention continued to rain a fusillade of blows onto his still form for the next 5 minutes. The entirety of Martin Brett's body was transformed into nothing more than a red paste mingled with shattered metal and bone fragments. Brett's cheating wife, Melissa, was in the kitchen. The noise coming from upstairs had become so commonplace that her mind had stopped tuning into it. Even the thunderous breaking down of the study door failed to alert her senses. The robot walked stiltedly out of the kitchen, almost tripping over the hideously mangled body of Brett's wife, and stood motionless in the hallway. It was dripping with blood. Brett's son, completely oblivious to the horrific events, continued his workout in the garage. The robot picked these noises up clearly, but a sensor was starting to pulse within the tangled mesh of its cerebral ganglia. That sensor was telling it to wait. When the doorbell rang at a little after 7, the robot dutifully went to answer it. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed this reading and would like to support our work here at HorrorBabble, please feel free to pay us a visit over at Patreon. Links to Patreon and the Bandcamp shop can be found in the video description below. Until next time, goodbye.